If you want to paint it black and white like this, and you say, I want a block of VLaMax and a block of VO2max training, then I would advise work on the VLaMax when you have the time. Like, your VLaMax is not your quick fix.
The Triathlon Show 238. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode we have part 2 of the interview with Sebastian Weber. Last week, if you didn't listen to that already, was a lot of it was to do about the new updated version of the INSCYD software, how it works, how accurate it is, and so on. But this week we will be more generally speaking about training and physiology. So not related to the software per se, but just the general concepts of that every endurance athlete and coach should know if they really want to get the most out of their training program. So we'll tackle various subjects like block periodization versus mixing different types of training, the time course of adaptations for VO2max and VLaMax, potential issues with high-intensity training, especially if your VLaMax is low, and differences in different disciplines, like differences between VLaMax when we compare cycling, running, and swimming. We will talk training zones, and we'll talk training stress and recovery, and an interesting aspect that Sebastian pointed out of using carbohydrate combustion rates to figure out how much intensity is feasible to do, or how much recovery is needed between those harder workouts in particular. So lots of great stuff coming up in this interview. We'll get right into it after thanking our sponsors, Precision Hydration. Precision Hydration make electrolytes to match your individual sweat sodium concentration. So they have low sodium concentration, medium sodium concentration, and high sodium concentration drink mixes that you can choose depending on where you sit on the scale. And to figure out where you sit on the scale, well, they have a simple online sweat test that you can take on precisionhydration.com. It takes just a few minutes, and you just need to answer 10 multi-choice questions, and that will give you a good ballpark estimate for where you sit. You can get 15% off your order if you want to try Precision Hydration's electrolyte products with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And thank you to ROKA that you can find on ROKA.com. ROKA are the world-leading manufacturers of wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear. And their most recently launched product is the newly updated version of their flagship wetsuit model. This is the Maverick X2. And it takes all that was great about the Maverick X and then adds some even more superb features to the new version, like a new taping technology that connects the hips and the shoulders for optimal transfer of force for the propulsion of the stroke, added buoyancy, so better buoyancy than the predecessor, and so on. They still have all those classic ROKA technologies like the arms up technology. So just taking something that was already great and making it better. You can get that or any other ROKA product for 20% off with the promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS. Now let's get into the interview. Just a quick note, apologies for the potential sound quality issues on my end. I'm not sure if we might manage to fix that in editing, but I had some poor microphone setting choices on when we did this interview. Unfortunately, I actually didn't check what I had set. So my mess up, sorry for that, but I hope that you still enjoy this interview. Let's hear it, the interview with Sebastian Weber. All right, and let's move into some questions about using this testing and testing results to inform training decisions. And one very common question that I've been thinking about a lot and that I get a lot is, if you have your results and you decide to focus on either VO2max is what you need to improve or VLaMax is what you need to change, what's your thinking around, should you kind of block periodize and focus mostly just on that one variable that you're trying to change, or versus hitting several different intensity levels or training zones and applying mixed stimuli in a training block?
Yeah, I would choose a block version. Of course, like if you say, okay, my first goal, my primary goal is whatever, let's say, for example, increase VO2max, and my secondary goal is to work on my VLaMax, then in this VO2max block, if you want to call it this way now, simplifying things, you don't want to do something that basically hampers what you're trying to do afterwards, right? So
Yep.
That should be pretty obvious. So, for example, maybe most common thing or most common problem you could run into in triathlon is say, I want to improve or increase my VO2max, and I'm doing whatever kind of interval training that accidentally increases my VLaMax. And then guess what? After 3 weeks, after 3 months, you come out of the block and find out FTP hasn't changed, basically because you increase VO2max and VLaMax simultaneously, and it blunts the effect. And you don't see it in the FTP, right? Because it's created of both. So that could be an issue here. But basically, I would always, especially in this scenario where you want to have a general answer and not something specific to an athlete, like with a specific athlete in a specific training program, it might be different. But the general, if you want to be on the safe side, so to speak, do it blockwise, concentrate on one, make sure that you are not hurting the other, so to speak, and then concentrate on the next one and try to conserve. That's the term I'm using. Try to conserve the what you achieved in the previous block. That's, by the way, I'm also doing it in cyclists. When you, for example, you want to work on your sprint data, your sprint ability, or you want to work on your leg speed or rhythm changes or something, then we sometimes do some little like reminder sessions, so to speak. So you have a maintained dosage of a specific training content, to keep what you've achieved beforehand.
Yeah. And what would be the time course of something like that? So, for example, if VO2max improvement is the primary goal, this might be very much a big, it depends, but can we give some general ideas of how long you should focus on one before you might move on to the other and move into maintenance mode with the former?
It is not really so much a depends answer, because if you look, for example, that VO2max is highly determined by your mitochondria mass, and if you look at the protein turnover time or half-life time of mitochondria protein, you can make an informed guess here. If you look at the time course of adaptation in something of like VO2max, you can expect to see the first changes, the first adaptation after already approximately 2 to 3 weeks, even though you might not be able to track it because it's not significant. Like it's not above the error of measurement of your metabolic cart or something. And then you can expect a good portion of adaptation happened after approximately 8 weeks or 6 to 8 weeks. So in this time period, if you would retest with your met card or something, you would expect to already see an adaptation. Not the full adaptation, right? It's not that it stops there after 6 weeks, obviously. But if the training works, right? If you basically went into the good direction, to the right direction with your training, you would be able to measure that in terms of VO2max after approximately 2 months at the latest. And then a full adaptation obviously takes longer, like until the training effect levels off. It can be 3 months and longer. And obviously there's a long-term adaptation. So even if you keep doing what you're doing, you will improve a little bit. So that's for the VO2max, talking about several weeks, a few months. And with the VLaMax, it's a little bit different because I personally like to differentiate between functional adaptation and a structural adaptation. And the functional adaptation, for example, you can achieve by changing your diet, right? You just go radically on a keto, fat, protein, whatever diet, and you can expect to, within a time course of a very few weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, you can expect your VLaMax to go down. first reactions even a little bit sooner. But that's not structural, right? As soon as you change your diet again, you flip it back to high carbohydrates, for example, in this case, you would see VLaMax flip around again. And then there's a structural adaptation, and this, especially with VLaMax, often takes several months. So expect something here which is longer. So if you want to paint it black and white like this, and you say, I want a block of VLaMax and a block of VO2max training, then I would advise work on the VLaMax when you have the time. Like, your VLaMax is not your quick fix, except for the diet thing, maybe, right? It's not your quick fix where you say, I have 4 weeks or 2 months until my competition, and now I start to work on my VLaMax and I expect a full adaptation. That's something you maybe want to do, during the winter training, or when you have 3-4 months of time, even if it's maybe spring to summer, right? Maybe you race in late summer, you start in spring. But if you want a structural change, the bottom line is you need to account for more time there.
And does that apply in both directions, both if you want to increase and if you want to decrease VLaMax?
Well, in general, yes, but I'm not saying that the time course is the same, because what you always have to remember is that the structural adaptation, or this, the VLaMax that you naturally have, so to speak, it's how you have been built, especially in terms of muscle fiber distribution. So there's a long-term adaptation. Like, you do the sport, you do endurance sport for years, VLaMax will come down. This is also one reason, for example, why in long-term endurance sports like Ironman, older people are able to become world champion, right? You will not see somebody in the late 30s become world champion in a 100-meter run normally, right? That's normally not the case. So this works in the long endurance sports, a marathon and triathlon and so on. So when you want to change it backwards, it gets harder when it goes against your nature. So if you by nature are, more like a slow twitch guy, and you don't have a high VLaMax anyway, and you want to bring it up, that's much, much harder, and also going to take much, much longer. And the magnitude of change you can expect is not that big. And you really have to be very specific. Like when we did it in cyclists, you have to really, pull all plugs here and whatever, substitute creatine phosphate, creatine monohydrate, go into the gym, do whatever you can to somehow get it higher over what you are naturally gifted for. Because especially with professional athletes in endurance sports, you then, on top of that, you have 25, 30 hours of endurance training, which is not necessarily helping increasing your VLaMax, right? So you fight against the nature and you fight against your bike training.
Yeah. Actually, that reminds me something that Jan Olbrecht talked about when he was on the podcast, is that too low a VLaMax, actually it might be in his book that he writes it in Science of Winning, he says that too low a VLaMax can be a bit dangerous in terms of it's easy to dig yourself a hole in training and easier to get into overtraining. And is that something that you agree with? And can you explain that if that is the case, or why that is?
I know
is the case potentially.
Yeah, I know Askar Jörgendorp. He has similar concerns about it. That it should not be too low, and it's definitely the case. Also, I would definitely agree with Jan here when it comes to how good you are able to cope with, especially high intense trainings. So. I would not agree when you say training load is determined here by, long hours, low intensity. Then it does not really hurt. What I can definitely confirm is that when you have a lower VLaMax, so to speak, it's a very thin line in terms of intensity when you do interval trainings. Then when you do an interval training, it's very easy to overload yourself and do a too hard interval that you are not able to cope with. That's much, much easier when you are a guy with a little bit higher VLaMax. It's not only the VLaMax, then it's also part of the buffering capacity, and especially what is a combination of your VO2max and VLaMax. And that's something that is very important here, because the VLaMax, the glycolytic part, is the feeder. It's producing the fuel for the aerobic metabolism. So if your VO2 max is 80, then then having a little bit higher VLaMax can be very nice, because it feeds your aerobic system. So especially in sports like swimming or rowing or athletics or track cycling or even road cycling, it's really helpful if your VLaMax is a little bit higher, and it also doesn't hurt that much, a little bit higher. And then if your VO2 max is lower, so the maximum amount of fuel you can take from your glycolytic system is lower, then obviously the VLaMax should be a little bit lower, can be a little bit lower.
Yeah, but the reason that it is a thin line with the high intensity training is that because it's easy to work your glycolytic system to really add its maximum capacity and it gets overloaded, or what is the mechanism there for that?
Yeah, so I think the way how you want to view it is, that's something, by the way, you're going to see an INSCYD soon as a visualization, because I think it will help a lot of coaches and athletes to understand their training intensity better. The way how you want to view it is that wherever you go in training, you normally base your training intensity as a percentage of a maximum, right? You go into the gym, you will do a 1 repetition maximum, you do 70% of FTP. If you read a scientific study, they do a certain percentage of VO2 max, right? You express normally the intensity that you have in training as a percentage of your maximum. That's what you do. Now, the difficulty is here that when you do an interval training, for example, you trigger two systems with two different maximums. So when you max out your VO2 max, because you're doing high intense interval training, you're doing VO2 max intervals, you maybe go at 110% of VO2 max whatsoever. The percentage that this triggers your VLaMax obviously differs with your VLaMax, right? So let's say, just give you one example, I'm making up the numbers here, right? Let's say your VO2 max is 60 and you go at 120% of that. And let's say this is 450 watts, to say something, to stick with that example. That's 450 watts. And your VLaMax is high, then this 450 watts is at a lower percentage of your VLaMax. So you're not loading the system that much, right? Now, you do the same 450 watts because the training intensity is based on your aerobic system, but your VLaMax is only 0.3. Or let's make it simple for myself, let's say 0.35. So it's exactly the half of the 0.7. Now, the load on your VLaMax will be much, much higher. It will be actually more than double because the activation of the glycolysis is different. But it's obviously simple math here, right? It's much, much higher. And this is we actually had a webinar which goes in this direction. It was called Why You Should or Not Should Base Your Training on FTP, which goes into the details here, which, if I may say, that lives on our website. So it's for free. You can go and watch it. That explains this very precisely. You base your training on one metric, but during this training, you're using two different systems, to say the least. I mean, also you apply a training stimulus on other systems, but we're talking about VO2 max and VLaMax here. So if you train at 100% or 120% whatsoever, doesn't matter, any percentage of VO2 max, the percentage load or stimulus on your VLaMax can be vastly different. And if this is low, then obviously the chances that you overload it, if you want to use this term, is much, much higher. Very simple math.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the webinar is highly recommended. I remember watching that webinar, and it was. I think I've watched all of your webinars, but that one I think was a particularly interesting one. One other question that, in terms of training, that has come up is in regard to running. So you gave quite a lot of training recommendations in our first podcast, and for cycling, for example, we now know that for VLaMax, if we want to reduce VLaMax, things like high torque work at moderate intensities is one of the ways that you can do that. With running, though, it's not as clear necessarily what is recommended. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, because it's not that obvious and it's not that straightforward, partly because of the running economy thing, right? And partly because you have eccentric and concentric work, and it changes a little bit. In running, it is in general a little bit easier to lower your VLaMax because in general your training intensity will be comparable higher than it is in cycling, right? If you, let's say, you run 3 hours per week in average, then most likely your normal running intensity will be above what would, metabolically speaking, your base intensity training zone in cycling, right? In your cycling base intensity, you might pedal along with 1.5 to 1 millimole of lactate with whatever, 60% of your threshold or something. And in running, in most cases, it's higher anyway already. And because of the running mechanics, then the load or the torque on the muscles might be higher as well anyway. So this said, it's not surprising that you sometimes see lower VLaMax in runners, and it's in general lower to decrease your VLaMax in running. But again, there's another layer like running economy in there. But in general speaking, right? In general speaking, it's a little bit easier. And then if you want to specifically train VLaMax in running, the same basic principles apply as they do in cycling. Just obviously, it's more difficult to work on the torque part. What you might want to do is you might want to do some uphill running. The logistical problem that you have to organize a very easy downhill, right? To not run very fast downhill and then have a very, very high intensity and hurt yourself in a worst case scenario. But besides that, it's really the same thing, right? Intensities that are not too low, maybe lowering carbohydrate intake a little bit, and trying if possible to do some uphill running as well if you have the possibilities there. So very, very similar from a general approach point of view.
Yeah. Yep. And swimming, what would you say about swimming?
For triathletes, with VLaMax, I wouldn't really care that much.
Okay.
So first, most people don't measure it anyway, because most people don't do the testing in the pool. Secondly, the effect of the economy, the effect of the how much energy you use is so much bigger than anything else for most non-professional triathletes, and sometimes even for the professionals. And so I would not really, maybe I'm simplifying things, but I would not really care that much on your VLaMax on swimming. I do definitely care about the economy, and I would definitely care about what wetsuit you have, or how you invest your energy there, because basically the density of the water is approximately simplified 900 times higher than the one of air, and this is why you need so much energy. So reducing the energy cost is the main key for faster swimming in most triathletes, I would say.
All right. Yeah, that makes sense. And then you have your training zones that you get from the report and from the test. And that's something that I want to get into a little bit. And I actually should have opened up a report, which I don't have, but I can do that quickly while I'm asking the question. Can you just discuss the training zones and sort of how and why you define them the way that you do?
Well, I can, yeah. It's a frequently coming question, obviously, and we're going to change them tremendously, because honestly, I know that's not answering the question, but let me first say that we, and especially me, I did not expect so much buzz around the training zones. I personally have to admit, I'm guilty to underestimate by far how important and how precise people are looking at training zones, because it's a training zone. It's not a training program. It's a zone, and how you apply this training zone, it's totally up to you. And if the training zone is important, it's totally up to you, right? So how we arrived at these training zones is basically give a zone for some, let's say, physiological ballparks where something's happening. So we have, for example, a fat max zone, which is around the intensity where fat oxidation rate are highest. We have an anaerobic threshold zone, which is a little bit above and below the maximum lactate steady state, FTP, anaerobic threshold, whatsoever. And then we have zones like the base training, which is a little bit more comprehensive than the standard base training because it takes into account your fueling, and it's not a simple standard, whatever X% of your FTP zone anymore. And then we have special zones like the lactate shuttling, going back and forth to between lactate accumulation and the same amount of lactate combustion. And this is what it currently is, and we can talk about the details and the problems. For example, the biggest problems actually occur in aerobic and anaerobic zones, because I think there's a general misunderstanding or misperception in those. But before we do that, let me say that in the future, we will basically hand over these training things to you as a coach, as a user, to define your own training zones. And that is because we see, we work in so many different sports. People who listen to this podcast will maybe mainly know INSCYD from triathlon or maybe from cycling, but we actually work also in rowing, in speed skating, in swimming, and we work in different countries. And lessons learned is every federation, every sport has different training zones, and they have all different training zones in different countries. So we are going to change massively how we present training zones, and you're going to be able to create your own ones to hopefully, cope with some of the misunderstanding or misinterpretation or misuse of training zones.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's just get into one that you said that has generated among the most amount of questions, the aerobic maximum zone. And I have the definitions in front of me here. So it basically goes from where oxygen demand is 100% of VO2max to where it's 110% of VO2max. And importantly here, that is oxygen demand and not uptake, demand being higher. So can you explain that? Because that's something that has puzzled me, to be honest, and I don't know quite why it is, because it seems high. That's the reason it has puzzled me.
Yeah, so look, let me start with something like a straightforward, like a fatmax zone, right? So if you look at a fatmax curve, forget about INSCYD, just look at, go to Google Images and put fatmax, and you will find the great work of Aska, for example, and whatever, you will see fatmax has an apex. Right? There is an intensity where the fat combustion rate is at the highest. And it's a range of maybe 40 watts or 30 watts, right? So it's very easy. It's very easy to come up, okay, this is your fat max zone, right? It's an apex. Now, the problem is it's not always that straightforward. So the truth is, any exercise, any effort above maximum lactate steady state will sooner or later result in reaching VO2max. Any effort which is above threshold will elicit VO2max. And this is a problem that we run into with the training zones, and we basically draw a line somewhere in the sand here, which is what you just defined here, right? But this is a problem I feel for everybody saying, I do VO2max intervals. What does that mean? Because you can do a 10-minute effort. Most people mean by that a 3 or 4 or 5 minute, maybe 6-minute effort. But you can do a 10-minute effort. You can even do a 20-minute effort, and you will reach VO2max, right? So this is a difficulty when you put up a training zone. And for example, we have an anaerobic zone, and the definition of the anaerobic zone that a certain percentage of the energy is derived by anaerobic metabolism, right? And here, the problem is maybe even more obvious, because obviously, the faster you go, the higher the intensity, the higher the aerobic energy contribution. So then, tell me, what is your anaerobic zone? Even at 200 watts, you maybe at 2% anaerobic energy combustion, right? Energy production, sorry. So the higher you go, the higher the anaerobic energy contribution. So where do you draw the line here, right? Like, what is for you then the anaerobic zone? Is it 20%? Is it 50%? Is it, right? How much energy contribution makes it an anaerobic effort for you? That's a struggle.
Good question. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, well, okay. I think with that is probably something that we can say for another day, and we can see what you guys have cooking and how the new zones will be presented. But I agree with the general point that you made, that the zones aren't the training program anyway. There are so many, and I don't. When I make do an insight test for one of my athletes, I don't give them the zones that you give. I use the zones as basis, but I adapt them in a special way that I've kind of developed.
Excellent. Love to hear that.
To make them continuous. That's something that I like to have, just a continuous set of zones.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not a point that we need to dwell on so much.
But I mean, just maybe to finish that off, something that also sometimes creates confusion is, why are the zones sometimes overlapping, right? Like you can have whatever your medio zone or tempo zone is overlapping, is almost the same as a fat max zone, for example, right? Or the fat max zone is in one case closer to the anaerobic threshold, in other cases further apart. I mean, sorry, this is the reason why you want to do a performance assessment, right? Because that's exactly what you want to know. You want to know, what is my fat max zone, because it's not always a fixed percentage of your VO2max or threshold or something, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is important to point out. And then last comment on this is, we define zones, like we said, right? The fat max zone, the threshold zone, and then we draw, so to speak, a line in the sand and say, okay, X amount of anaerobic energy contribution is your anaerobic zone. And it's important, I think, similar like you do, to understand how this zone is derived and how it is defined. But then it doesn't necessarily mean that your athlete should train in that. For example, we often have this problem in running. When you have a runner who's not highly trained, VO2max 40, average running speed is whatever in training, 6 minutes or 7 minutes per kilometer or something, right? Then when you do a lactate test, you can see at this intensity is maybe the lactate level is maybe already 2.5, directly measured, nothing calculated, right? Forget about all the fancy calculations. That's what you've measured in your raw data. Now, you look into a textbook and it says long, slow, distant base intensity training in running is a lactate concentration of 1.5. And then what you get as a training zone is something ridiculous high, like whatever, 9 minutes 30 per kilometer or 8 minutes 45 per kilometer running speed as long, slow, distance base intensity. And then we have sometimes people who are confused and say, yeah, but this is not running. That's, I don't want to run that slow. And then the answer is, well, but this is how the training zone has been defined also in the textbooks. That's nothing we came up with. The point is, if you only run, so to speak, I mean, I shouldn't say that only, because I run much less. But if you only run, let's say, 3 times a week for 40 minutes, well, why should you run then in that long, slow distance zone? Then it's totally fine if you run in tempo a little bit above tempo, right? Because the effort is short and you have a lot of rest in between the training days. So, and this sometimes creates confusion, right? People think, that's my daily training, so it has to be base zone, but it's actually not. Or from a metabolic point of view. And this is where the training zones come from. They come from metabolic point of views, and it's no fixed percentage. They are derived from what we call it the master metrics. So the anaerobic threshold is derived from anaerobic threshold, fat max is derived from fat combustion, VO2max is derived from VO2max, and so on and so forth.
Yep, that's a great example, and that brings to mind another question which I want to talk about, which is what's your view on dosage? So you mentioned there that if you only run 3 times per week, then you might as well run, and you're a slower runner, you might as well run a tempo all the time, which makes sense. What's your general view on like dosing of, for example, let's say you are working on VO2max, how often should you be doing intervals and so on? If you're working on VLaMax, how often should you be doing some sort of high torque or medio efforts and those sorts of things? Can you just discuss freely on that dosage topic?
Well, yeah. I'm not sure if the dosage really, for many people, is so much of an issue. The dosage maybe becomes an issue depending on how you can perform your recovery in between, and how much stressed and occupied you are by your normal life besides the the training maybe. But then basically if the intensity is low enough, then the duration in terms of dose is mostly not really a problem, right? If you just go slow enough. And so what I would do as the most simplified approach, I would try to maximize the time I can spend, so the training duration, right? And then have the training intensity come second and say, okay, and look at it and say, okay, now, giving that I can train 5 hours per week or 10 hours or 15 hours or whatever it is, how much intensity can I put in there? And what you will find is that when it comes to the higher intensity stuff, it is not a percentage question anymore. Like no matter if you are training twice a week or every day for several hours, the amount of high intense training will plateau, it will level off, right? You can have whatever, let's say approximately 2 hours per week of net training time. So not counting the resting intervals between intervals, for example, right? And then if you train 20 hours per week, that's maybe like, 10%. And if you're training just 6 hours per week, then it's 30% high intense training. Because it's not the percentage, it is a total amount that you have here.
Yeah.
And when you plan that,
what do you define here as the higher intensity? Is it everything that is sort of above threshold, or is it, what's your definition of higher intensity here?
Yeah, when it comes to the overall weekly plan, I think a good indicator what you want to look at, very old school, but very, functions very good, works very well, is look at your carbohydrate combustion. Look at your carbohydrate combustion and look which training will empty the tank, so to speak. Because when you empty the tank and you want to train the next day and you don't have enough time to recover and refill, you're hampering the training on the next day, right? And you might hamper the quality of the training because you cannot do the hard intervals the next day, and you may be at risk of getting sick and decreasing performance. So I think this is a very good indicator, right? Use the carbohydrate combustion to make an informed decision. How much carbohydrate did you use? And then think about the next day. Will you be able to do this exercise, even if you maybe need to fuel during the exercise, or is it too long or too hard? And this is how this is for me how you build a training program. When I write a training program, I think more about the recovery until the next session than about the session itself when I fit it into the overall concept. And a good metric to make an informed and educated decision on that is looking at the carbohydrate, combustion. And then for the intensity itself, so let's say you have placed your higher intensity training, right? And then this answers the question if it's above threshold or as threshold, right? It's a question of intensity and duration, obviously. When you have placed your high intensity training in your training program, then you can use, for example, lactate accumulation and recovery to make an informed decision on, okay, what is the dose, what is the work to rest ratio, right? In that interval session. Then it comes to the fine tuning. But the question, can I do 2 of them in a row? Do I have to space them out by 1 day or 2 days? Is a question of what is happening in this 1 or 2 days, right? And for this, use the carbohydrate combustion.
Yeah, that's a really insightful answer. Really, really interesting. And two more questions actually that I have. The first one is, what differences would you expect if you test in aero versus sitting up in terms of the differences in VO2max and VLaMax and so on?
This is a depends question, or this is a depends answer. When you go in a lab scenario and you put a mask on, you will see bigger differences in terms of, you could see higher VO2max in the aero position, which sometimes is additional muscle usage, for example, to hold this position, or especially you can easily get 100, 200 milliliters from additional oxygen demand of the breathing muscles because of the position you are in. And then in terms of power output, you might lose a little bit on power, but there comes your it depends answer, because that obviously depends on your aero position and how good you are adapted to it. Because if you have your position set up properly, in a proper way, and you gave your time, you gave yourself time to adapt to it and train with it, then you should not see any differences anymore between road bike and TT bike, except for a sprint maybe, right? I would not advise doing a sprint in the aero position really. But that hopefully answers the question here.
Yeah, and one specific on that. So the 20-second sprint in the protocol as well, even if you do the rest of the test in in aero position, would you recommend doing the 20-second test you would do seated?
Yeah, you would always do it seated. That's something which is greatly overlooked, especially when you use training data to interpret your performance development, right? It's something specific in cycling. It doesn't really happen in running. Like when you have a critical speed curve in running, then you don't have to be afraid of mixing up too many different things, right? You maybe mix up whatever, running in the forest and running on a paved road, but you don't mix up that many things. In cycling, you have the problem when you take your training data and look at a power duration curve or something, you're mixing up different power meters at worst case, you're mixing up different bikes, maybe road bike versus TT bike, and you're mixing out standing and out of the saddle, and then you mix up indoors and outdoors, which has a significant effect on power output. You mix up uphill and flat, which has an effect on your power output. So that creates a pretty good mess in your power duration curve data when it's derived from training. So when you test and you want to have accurate results, I strongly recommend that you test in the same conditions you want to use the data for. So if you mainly train on your TT bikes, then you want to test on your TT bike. And if you mainly train on your road bikes, then you maybe want to test on your road bike. Or you can even do 2 tests and differentiate, which is like what the pro cyclists are doing. But I don't think it's really necessary in triathlon, I guess.
Yeah. And well, that's a nice segue into the final question, which is INSCYD is collaborating with several of the pro tour teams. And I just wanted to hear, as I understand that you might not be able to share much details, but what can you tell us about how they're using INSCYD and how they are basically making training decisions based on the results from testing?
I think I can share some insights here. Without naming people maybe directly, but it highly depends. It highly depends on the team, and it highly depends on the coach. What they do with the data, because there are different coaches with different coaching styles, obviously, right? What I can say to maybe bring it full circle with the PPD is that some of the professional teams, like the CCC team, have been using the PPD already 6 months before the launch as beta users, together with some, coaching businesses and some individual professional coaches. And they're using it as a full substitute for lactate testing and or lab testing. Because they see it gives them the same level of accuracy, and it's a full substitute. And I think that's something actually I'm very happy with. And if you would have asked me a year ago, I would not have answered that this is going to happen, because we didn't know about the accuracy then. So that's a benefit for them, especially during the times now with lockdown, and they cannot get in touch with their riders and do lactate tests, and they don't see them in races, and they don't see that in training camps. So they're using the data to make an informed decision on how athletes are maintaining their fitness level in a general way in the current situation, and then it really depends. We have coaches who base mostly all of their training entirely on the INSCYD test results. So on the one hand, what should I train? So the general direction of the training, is it more towards VLaMax? Is it more towards VO2max? More towards lactate shuttling or whatsoever? As well as the small details, right? So again, using like the lactate accumulation and recovery lactate to fine tune the kind of intervals. And this is different. We have people who use it parallel to the normal training process to look at INSCYD data as well as part of the puzzle. And we have coaches who use a test and create a training program entirely based on that, and need to retest relatively often to stay up to date. And that's, by the way, something not only in cycling, but that's the same in swimming or in other sports. You have different coaching styles, and how people are using the data varies a lot, actually.
Yeah. That gives a good overview. What is if we keep talking about benchmarks a little bit, what would a GC rider, for example, aim for? I mean, VO2max as high as possible, obviously, but VLaMax, what would they aim for versus, for example, somebody who is good at like the 1 day classics, and then on the opposite end of the spectrum from the GC, the sprinter? Can you just give the VLaMax benchmarks for those types of riders?
Yeah, so VLaMax in a GC rider should usually not be lower than 0.3. We talked about it briefly. It depends a little bit on the VO2max, and obviously with those guys having a high VO2max, you need a feeder. Also, simplified speaking here, you need a feeder for the aerobic system. And then what has to be taken into account that in most cases the VLaMax goes down during the course of a 3-week stage race. So you don't want to hit the Tour de France or Vuelta or Giro with a too low VLaMax, because then by the end of the race, when it comes to the decisive final week, it might be too low to actually counter attack or attack your opponents on the climb. So that's difficult. That's a thin line, and this is where teams have been using INSCYD to really understand, okay, how does it change, during the course of a Tour de France, for example, and then learn from it for the next year, right? Learn, okay, my athlete dropped his VLaMax by X percentage in this race, so next time I want to go higher into the race because it was maybe too low at the end. The classic rider is a more difficult question, because you have within the classic riders, you have people who are more like time trialists, and you have people who are more like sprinters. And then the time trialist guys obviously are a little bit lower, and the sprinter guys, who most likely win their classics from sprints, are a little bit higher. In general, you would see a range between 0.4 and 0.6 approximately, rarely higher. And also, athletes who then switch, like Christoph or Sagan, who switch between classics and then sprints and the Grand Tours, they are lowering the VLaMax in the spring, and they're increasing it then for the sprints, in the big stage races. And this said, for the sprinters, it can almost not be too high for a road sprinter, because with all the endurance training going on, it's difficult to get it super high anyway. So this said, you will have difficulties to win a sprint in the Tour de France these days if your VLaMax is 0.7 or lower. That's going to be very difficult, because the extra power output associated with that is relatively high. And if you look at the energy contribution in a Tour de France sprint, glycolytic energy supply is the main source of energy in a sprint. And that's by now pretty well understood, if I may say that. I had an anecdote last year. I was giving a workshop with a World Tour cycling team, and we discussed about their sprinter. And during this workshop, with a coach of a sprinter who won several stages in the Tour de France in a sprint the year before, the news came in that one other of the fastest sprinter in the world was doing, the classics or something later on, even after the classics, like a stage race. And the coach of the sprinter laughed and said, that's great, because he said, I already knew. He says, I already know that it's too short to bring up his VLaMax again. So he already ruled him out of the sprints of the first week of the Tour de France, because he said, if he's doing this race program, this close, like running whatever 6 or 8 weeks close to the Tour de France, there's no chance he brings his VLaMax. So people by now understand this in professional cycling, really, that you need a high VLaMax to be able to sprint these days, because the sprint power tremendously went up in the last years in those sprints in professional cycling.
Yeah, interesting that there's been such a development. Actually, I have one more question that I forgot. And that is, are there any signs from training for people that maybe for whatever reason don't have access to do an INSCYD test that can give them some information about whether their focus should be on increasing VO2max versus reducing VLaMax, if we're talking primarily here about triathlon for amateurs?
Well, science or science?
Sciences, and not
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I got confused here. It's difficult. It's really difficult because to really get a kind of a valid estimate, even estimate, especially view on VLaMax, is really difficult. The marketing answer would be, but there's a PPD test. You can do it remotely. So you always have access to a test. The non-marketing answer basically is think about a little bit how many hours you train to have an estimate, for example, about your VO2max. Or maybe you have one of these watches that give you an estimate, not that it's accurate, but it's an estimate. I mean, you will know if you have 40 or 60 VO2max. And then you can already rule out, right? You can already rule out if your VO2max is more 40 because you just, have time to train 5-6 hours a week. Then honestly, as I said, don't bother too much about your VLaMax yet, right? So that's something I would do. And then, for example, in terms of training dosage, if you don't have access to carbohydrate combustion curves, then I would take this knowledge and at least monitor myself, or have maybe retrospectively look, okay, is there a typical day I bonk, or is there a typical day I feel weak? And then maybe think about, okay, maybe it's not enough time to recover in between the sessions, right? Maybe with that, what you've learned now, maybe try to fuel more carbohydrates and see if it's getting better. And then there is a sign that, maybe carbohydrate combustion in the training is an issue, right? So you have to do these little tests with yourself to find out if, for example, carbohydrate could be an issue, or VO2max is rather low. These kind of things.
All right. Yeah. So before we go, is there anything else you want?
Yeah.
Sorry. Go, yeah.
Yeah. And basically, personally, I would like to add that this is maybe more important and maybe makes you a better training, helps you creating a better training program than puzzling around if your FTP is 10 watts more higher or not, right? Because it doesn't matter, like if your FTP is 250 watts or 240, and then you take whatever 70% of that for your base training, that doesn't matter. I mean, is of no relevance, right? What comes out is whatever 180 watts or 184 watts. You cannot even control this in training. It's much more important to get the overall picture right? What kind of intervals am I doing? Am I maybe not fueling enough? Do I maybe need to train more or change my training in terms of intensity to get a higher VO2max? This is much, much more important than trying to puzzle around with the last 5 or 10 watts of your FTP or something, right? Doesn't really matter, to be honest. I think there's way too much buzz around that.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. That's really, really great advice. So finally, before we go here, is there anything else you want to mention in terms of what's next for INSCYD, what you're working on, and where you want people to follow you, webinars and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make it a marketing podcast here, so I'm not going to talk about products or whatsoever. But yeah, most definitely I can give you an informed update or emphasis that, we do have webinars which are for free. So far, all of our webinars as for today are for free. So you can just go on our website and watch those. If you want to dive a little bit deeper into that knowledge. And what I can tell you is that all this information educational piece is what we're going to focus a little bit more in the next couple of weeks and months. So what you can expect is to see much more content in terms of learning. We recently created what we call an INSCYD College, which is an e-learning center where INSCYD users can take courses and get educated, and this just started. And this is the main thing here for us in the next months. What you're going to see. And then, I think for your listeners here in terms of triathlon, the most stuff we are working on currently from a technical point of view is more for the mostly for the Olympic sports, for midterm duration, 2, 3, 4 minute efforts, some improvements and analysis there. And one thing I really would like to get going, but it's not that straightforward, is to get something like a PPD in running. Emphasis a little bit more on the running testing, and that might be interesting for your audience here, because obviously running is maybe the one single most important discipline in triathlon, and it would be really good to get a better grip on your metabolism, on your physiological profile, without the need to do a lactate testing. So I'm pretty sure that's something that's going to happen in the next months.
Okay, well, that's really cool. And I think as well, I want to personally say that I'm excited to see more of that educational content. I think that's an important part, and I think a lot of coaches listening to this will also be very happy to hear that.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Sebastian. This was a long one. I kind of expected it would be, but I'm really happy with that we covered so much ground, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this and sharing all your knowledge.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks everybody who's stayed with us for such a long time.
Yeah.
Okay, Michael. Until next time. Thank you.
Until next time. Bye.
Cheers.
So I hope that you enjoyed part 2 of this interview with Sebastian. A couple of notes that we discussed off air afterwards that we then realized that we didn't really talk about, and that Sebastian did say that if I could mention it would be great. So here they are. It's really, Sebastian has put an immense amount of effort into making sure that all of this is really, really accurate and legit. It's been tested by 2 pro teams that have verified the testing against their own lactate testing protocols, and they have spent 2 years testing this and verifying all of the calculations and the algorithms using statistical data that they have collected over years, internal and external data, biopsy data, and so on. So that's just to give you a little bit of an idea of what effort has gone into the development of the power performance decoder. And I should probably have mentioned this in the last episode, because that's when we actually talked about the power performance decoder, whereas this episode was more about training and adaptations and physiology. But there you go. I think that most people that listen to this episode also listen to the last one. As usual, you can find the show notes for the episode on scientifictriathlon.com. We will have a link to related episodes, and of course, if you haven't listened to the previous one, go and listen to that. But also remember that we had Sebastian on back in episode 169, where he talked about FTP, VO2max, VLaMax, and the physiology of those 3 and how they relate in detail. So that is sort of the background knowledge that you really need to have to get the most out of these episodes that you've been hearing these last couple of weeks. So check that out. You can also check out the INSCYD testing service on scientifictriathlon.com. Just click through in the main navigation menu. On next week's Monday episode, I interview Nick Tiller. He is a professor of exercise science, and he is the author of The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science. And that is a really fascinating interview on a topic that I think is super important. It really is about critical thinking and putting on a bit of a skeptic's hat when needed. And that is, in this day and age, not just in sports science, basically all the time. You need to have a strong filter up. And this episode will really go into some aspects of the sport and fitness industry where that filter needs to be particularly strong, but also just general strategies and thought patterns that you can apply to improve your critical thinking skills and ability to distinguish the good from the bad from the ugly in any industry. So superb interview. I really enjoyed that one. It's been a while since I recorded it, but I'm looking forward to releasing it to the public. So definitely stay tuned for that. And of course, a Q&A will be out on Thursday as usual. If you have enjoyed this podcast, and you are a long-time listener especially, and you haven't yet left a rating and review for the podcast, it would be absolutely great if you could do that. It just takes a couple of minutes of your time, and ratings and reviews have been a bit flat recently because I have simply forgotten to ask about them. So I'm doing it now. It really helps out, helps more listeners find the podcast and helps keep it going. So take a couple of minutes to leave a rating and review if you will. That would be really, really great. Finally, thank you to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Take their free online sweat test to get a personal hydration strategy for racing or for training and general events that you might be setting up for yourself in the summer. You can get 15% off your order with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And thank you to ROKA that you can find on roka.com/TTS. On that page, you will get a 20% discount code that you can use on any of ROKA's wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses or sunglasses. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.